say thank you to all those people I've worked with over many decades on peace campaigning. They have taught me a great deal about the realities of war and a great deal about the possibilities of peace. We marched against the Iraq War in 2003, not because we were supporters of the regime of Saddam Hussein, but because we didn't want a war in the region and what we felt would be a decade or decades of subsequent wars and instability. And we look now across the piece and it's a very difficult situation. There has to be a political settlement in Syria. There has to be support for the refugees, but also there has to be determination around the world for a world order on all sides of the Atlantic and indeed all over the world. We have to work together for peace, just as we marched together against the Iraq War in 2003.
I'd just like to add a few words from what Jeremy said and maybe ask him a couple of questions. Firstly, we've seen recently the escalation of tensions again around Korea, which I'm sure is of great concern to everybody at the conference. We've had the testing of missiles by North Korea, but also the threat now from South Korea, which has released plans about how it will be prepared to destroy whole cities, the whole capital of North Korea. And these are times, we live in very, very dangerous times. We have, as we speak, there's talk about a ceasefire in Syria, but we know this is only the beginning of a deadly, of trying to end this deadly conflict which has been going on and which doesn't show massive signs of being able to do so. We also know the role of the various imperial powers in these countries, and we also have the question of nuclear weapons, which I know is very, very important to your conference this weekend. We've had a debate over Trident in Parliament where we lost the vote for the to stop the renewal of Trident, despite Jeremy's best efforts and the best efforts of a number of MPs. So there are those questions. I suppose what I'd like to just ask Jeremy to comment on before, just to bring this to a halt, is how, Jeremy, if you were, and we hope you will be in government, we hope you'll be a Prime Minister. I won't comment on who might be the next President of the United States, because obviously that's a decision for you and maybe not a particularly happy one when you look at the record of both of them on war and peace. I'd just like to ask you, Jeremy, what do you think as a Prime Minister you would do? What would be your steps towards bringing about a more peaceful world?
First of all, there is obviously a crisis in Korea, across the Korean Peninsula and across the region. I would urge rapidly reopening of the six-party talks, rapidly moving towards demilitarization of the Korean Peninsula and the whole region. That is a huge, very, very long-term objective, but immediately the reopening of the six-party talks has to be an important step forward, and making the non-proliferation treaty a force that can deal with this. There are problems because Korea is not a signatory to the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but the six-party talks, working in parallel with them, can help to bring that about. And Lindsay's right that in the situation in Syria at the moment, it is clearly incredibly dangerous. There is a refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced or killed because of this war. And there has to be a humanitarian response to the refugee crisis, a ceasefire that means something.
A lot of people, when we say reconciliation, it's post-disarmament or post-conflict. But I would like to kind of pose it, what if we use reconciliation as a means to achieve some sort of peace, or achieve or catalyze state movement towards peace? And so actually, within the context of, North Korea and South Korea, in the late 1990s and early into the 2000s, Korea actually did move towards a reconciliation policy called the Sunshine Policy. It was induced by President Kim Tae-jung. In our legends, it said that there was a man who was stubbornly wearing a coat right? And there are two elements. There was the wind and the sun, and both elements wanted this man to take off the coat. But the two elements kind of were arguing amongst each other who could get the coat off quickest or most effectively. And so they kind of made a deal, and then they said, okay, go and try to take this man's coat off. So the wind decided, okay, I'm going to try to blast the coat off of the man. And so it rushed and, tried to take off his clothing, but it didn't work. And then the sun said, okay, watch this. And then as the sun grew warmer and warmer and warmer, the man himself took off the coat because he was hot. And so President Kim, he said, let's take a similar approach to DPRK in terms of disarmament. Let's induce, let's engage our civil societies. Let's be warm to our North Korean counterparts. Let's open up trade deals. Let's open up economic opportunities. Let's invest in their society. And it worked fairly well, actually. And although a lot of critics say, it was a failed policy, within the context of North and South Korea, it surprisingly did soften some sort of communication between the two. However, conflicts started to arise when, with the next wave of presidency in South Korea, legal institutions were denouncing, the nuclear armament and proliferation in North Korea. And that put South Korea in a position where it had to choose between its commitment to reunification with North Korea or its commitment to the international community. And that's where we stand today. We see that in our geopolitics in the East Asian region. We see South Korea continually being in the spot of having to choose between its alliances with, the United States and other international, global powers, and its relationship with its brother country.
So what do we mean by a racial settler state? So settlers, in coming to a particular territory, seek the removal of an indigenous population along with the creation of a racial hierarchy of subsequent domination. Now, removal, in other words, this is not just colonialism. It's a subset of colonialism. It's not just setting up territory. It's basically coming to a particular place and saying that the indigenous population will be removed. The settler state is not seeking any kind of mixture with the indigenous population. It is seeking, it will rape them, but it is not interested in mixing with them. It seeks their removal, and the removal can be annihilation, or the removal can be just forcing people off the land. And so we have many examples of racial settler states on this planet, the United States being a very successful one. You also have South Africa, of course, the former Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. You have Israel, Australia, New Zealand, all having certain things in common, as is Ireland, which was in many ways a very successful prototype for the development of a settler state.
Back in the 1980s, we all understood the extent of the nuclear threat that we faced. And we understood that nuclear weapons could destroy human civilization and possibly destroy our species. That understanding has largely vanished from the world. With the end of the Cold War, people concluded incorrectly that the danger had gone away and really stopped thinking about it. And that includes many of us who are in the peace activist community as well. But of course, as we know, at some level, the danger did not go away. There are still about 15,000 nuclear warheads in the world, the vast majority in the arsenals of the United States and Russia. And there are 7 other nuclear weapon states as well. And we have learned in recent years several things that are quite alarming. One is that it would not take necessarily a full-scale war between the United States and Russia to destroy human civilization. A much more limited conflict could do that. And number 2, we have learned that our world is changing in other ways that are very destabilizing. Particularly, and I'm not going to talk about this a lot today, but we'll be talking about it tomorrow more in the workshop on this subject. Climate change is putting increasing stress on the entire planet and dramatically increasing the danger of conflict, including the risk that conflict will escalate to nuclear war. We've concluded in our studies that up to 2 billion people worldwide would be at risk of starvation as a result of a limited regional war confined to India and Pakistan or any other similar war of similar size. The death of 2 billion people is not the end of our species, but it is almost certainly the end of modern civilization. No civilization in human history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there's no reason to think that modern industrial civilization would do so. We know now of at least 6 incidents during the nuclear weapons era. 5 of them are listed here, and one we just found out about after I made this slide. 6 incidents in which either Moscow or Washington prepared to launch nuclear war in the mistaken belief that the other side had already done so. And the most recent of these, as you can see on the date there, January 25th, 1995, was well after the end of the Cold War. These are the incidents that are in the public domain that we know about. There have almost certainly been others.
So those of you who are in peace and in nonviolence and activism, please understand that affect your children too and people around you. I have a very strong family, and the most enjoyable part of my family is to come and see me in jail. And they enjoy that every time, because every time I have a new story for them. And that becomes. Being a Palestinian is not easy. And having difficulty in presenting myself as a Palestinian, also as a Christian Palestinian, and that confuses a lot of people because they think that being an Arab, I have to be a Muslim. And then some people ask me when I was converted to Christianity, and I will tell people, look fellows, we were Christian from the time of Christ and the disciples, and for all of you here who are Christians, they are because of me, because of us on that. I build on a good, I build on a good principle, and the guiding way for me was my mother. My father was shot when I was 5 years old in 1948, and my mother took me aside when I was 5 and told me, don't ever carry a gun, don't ever kill a person. The one who killed your dad, he doesn't know that he left me as a widow with 7 kids. In 4 weeks after that, I was in an orphanage, and then in my school, they want to have one of those army drills for 2 weeks. And I refused to carry a gun. And they put a machine gun on me, tie it on me, and they have all the students to come and spit on me for 2 weeks. And instead of getting upset and angry, I was very happy. I say, I made it. I was able to make it.
As Alice mentioned in her introductory remarks, we've come together in the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, a global campaign involving over 490 NGO organizations in 95 countries across the planet, and working with over 130 non-nuclear weapon states, trying to bring about legally binding steps that will end the nuclear weapons era. This movement is led in large part by young people, mainly in Europe, but also in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and increasingly in Latin America, and increasingly now in North America. And this movement is going to have, I believe, a very major success next month, when a resolution will be tabled at the United Nations General Assembly calling for the commencement of negotiations next year on a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, to define their possession as being illegal, a step which the non-nuclear weapon states believe will put significant pressure on the nuclear powers to meet their obligations to get rid of their nuclear arsenals.
There is now about 56% of the Earth that's under the control of nuclear-free zone. And to think that there cannot be nuclear weapon made, maintained, sold, or transported in those zones, I try to support the development on this Middle East nuclear-free zone that became in 1990 a weapon of mass destruction free zone under the advice of Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt. The first people that spoke about this nuclear weapon-free zone were actually Iran and Egypt in 1963, so it's not a new development.
Unarmed civilian protection has been used by 56 organizations in 37 countries between 1990 and 2015. This is a growing phenomenon, and it's growing because it's people around the world can do it, and it's accessible for people to be able to do it. One of the most often used methods is protective accompaniment. Here you see one of our civilian protectors, Tiago, who is from Brazil. This is a scene in South Sudan where you know that millions of people have been displaced with the reignition of a war in December of 2013. They've been displaced into what are called protection of civilian areas. Every day, women have to leave to collect firewood so that they can prepare meals. And cadres of both government soldiers and rebel militia will lurk on the perimeter of the camp and will gang rape the women as a strategy of war. What we have found is if 3 to 5 people like Tiago accompany 20 to 30 women, the soldiers look the other way. This has been 100% successful. This is an example from Sri Lanka where there was a rampant use of child soldiers. One morning, a group of mothers came to our team in the town of Valachennai and wanted to go after their kids who had been kidnapped the night before by the Tamil Tigers. So our team listened, and it was no secret where they were being held in the jungle. So we accompanied the moms who confronted the young commanders in their 20s themselves, who had been child soldiers. And those young men said to these moms, "You go away. This is no longer your matter." The moms held firm. And there was only 6 of us from 6 different countries standing behind the moms. Those young commanders were smart enough to know to call for their superiors who came out. Negotiations went on, and the 26 boys who had been kidnapped were sent home. So they pointed those guns at Derek and Andreas and said, "You have to get out of here. We want those people." On all 3 occasions, they calmly just held up their nonviolent peace force badges, said, "We are unarmed. We are here to protect civilians, and we will not leave." On the 3rd occasion, the militia left. And Derek and Andreas will tell you that if they would have been armed, they would have been killed.
I think most of you know, more or less, that the United States military encircles the globe with roughly 800 bases outside the United States in around 80 foreign countries on other people's land. I think most of you know that this collection of bases is a relatively new and unusual phenomenon in U.S. history, that while the United States has had bases outside its own territory since around the time of independence, the creation of a truly global system of hundreds upon hundreds of foreign bases dates to World War II and the earliest days of the Cold War.
Increasing number of military facilities, U.S. military facilities are used together with the Japanese military. Well, we are not supposed to have the military. That's what our constitution says. But we do have the other full-fledged military called the self-defense forces. That's as powerful as, well, not as the United States, but one of the most powerful militaries in the world. And that happens in other countries in the region. For example, the Philippines. You're not supposed to be there. You left 20 or so, almost 30 years ago. Now the U.S. military is back, but the facilities that the U.S. military uses is those of Philippine military. So if you just take a look at the number of U.S. military facilities, you will miss a larger picture.
U.S. bases abroad cause a series of often rather horrific damage to local populations, local communities, local countries. I think most of you know about the crimes and accidents, like recurring rapes and murders in Okinawa, that Kazue will discuss in important detail momentarily, that are regular features of the base world, and how crimes and accidents and simple occupation have consistently generated anger, protest, and opposition among locals. I think most of you know that overseas bases have caused widespread environmental damage. I think most of you know that bases have all too often created systems of institutionalized and exploitative camp town prostitution in places like South Korea and beyond. I think most of you understand that camp town prostitution helps produce a kind of militarized masculinity in the U.S. military and contributes to the widespread dehumanization of women, helping to shape the military's epidemic of sexual assault and harassment. I think most of you know that the disproportionate presence of bases in places that lack full democratic rights within the United States, such as Guam and Puerto Rico, has helped perpetuate U.S. colonialism into the 21st century. I think most of you know that the U.S. military, unfortunately, has a long track record of displacing local populations, often indigenous peoples in particular, from the millions of Native Americans displaced, dispossessed, and killed with the help of U.S. Army forts on Native lands, to some 20 cases of displacement since 1898 alone in places like Vieques, Okinawa, Guam, Greenland, and on the Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia. I also think most of you know that bases abroad have helped support human rights abusing militaries, repressive regimes, and dictators in at least 33 undemocratic countries, such as Bahrain, Qatar, Singapore, Honduras, Djibouti, and Ethiopia, to name just a few.
The struggle has been going on, at least in Okinawa, for 71 years. And it's getting even worse for the past year or two, particularly with the you have outgoing government and current ambassador to Japan is Caroline Kennedy, and she's leaving soon in December, and it's been speculated that the increasing pressure by the Japanese government, our government, on these people's protest. It's something to do with her leaving. We want to have the Japanese government, not me. The Japanese government wants to have some kind of gift before when she leaves. That is the building of new military base in Henoko. That has not been possible because of the direct action of the people for the past 20 years.
Just as the war on terror has become a global war that only seems to spread terror, the creation of new U.S. bases to protect against imagined future Chinese and Russian threats runs the risk of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The pressure by the Japanese government is getting worse and worse. Like literally, at this very moment, many people are out there, sat there to prevent both military vehicle, but also construction vehicle to come into the base to continue this construction. The Camp Schwab, within Camp Schwab, they already started to build more buildings with them, but they have not. The U.S. military has not been able to build anything out on the sea because of that sitting, and that has been going on for I can't even count, at least 2004, and that's the very, very direct action to sitting on the sea. It's and and many of them
Many of them are injured. And elderly people who survived the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, and she's still out there.
Conscientious objectors, or COs, start like Father Zabelka did, with what's in front of them, with what they're witnessing, what they're doing, what they're failing to do. And they start by recognizing that something is wrong. And then this prick to the conscience evolves into a realization that all war is wrong.
I grew up in this culture of perpetual violence where killing was normalized, where the act of taking other people's free will was common and unquestioned in large part. And as all children do, I absorbed. I absorbed what I saw around me, and I tried to portray what I saw around me because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. I played with sticks and pretended to kill things. I eventually got toy guns and pretended to kill things. I pretended war. Eventually this moved to video games, more pretend war, where things like headshots got you extra points and ridiculous vocabulary like kill-tacular meant you did a good job. And it wasn't for a year after getting out of my training that I actually began to ponder this. And it was upon taking my college classes in sociology and philosophy. After that semester, I began to look into things that I perceived as the opposite side, just to see if maybe it would open my eyes to it, or maybe, if anything, it would settle my doubts. I began to listen to music that was politically engaged in peace activism. I began to look at documentaries that were opposed to the military action of the world. And after letting these set in for over 6 months and trying to deny and suppress these forming beliefs that were conflicting with my current ideals of enjoying the military, enjoying the people that I spent time with in the military, I came to the realization that questioning them was the right thing to do, and that participating in the military was not. But keep in mind, even those people that at one time took life because they thought it was a good thing to do for the world, to make the world a better place, they can make efforts if we make efforts to make them better people.
18-year-old Zach from rural North Carolina wanted to be a soldier since he was a little boy. He didn't join because he wanted to take other human lives, but because he wanted to make something better of his own. When he arrived at basic training, it didn't take long for him to realize that the Army didn't care what he wanted. "They're trying to make me a killer," he told me, choking back tears. When he refused their training, he was physically and emotionally abused. And in his jail cell on Fort Benning, he looked down at his belt and up at the rafters. But thankfully, he didn't have to take that step. He found a way out. He found a way to follow his conscience, just as countless men and women have done throughout history. As long as there has been war, there have been conscientious objectors. Among the horrible and unspeakably tragic stories coming out of Syria, there are also many that speak to the best angels of our nature. The one that fits here is one about the hundreds of thousands of young men who are choosing to leave their homes, not out of fear for their own lives, but for fear that they will be conscripted to take the lives of others. These young men are conscientious objectors, and we should call them that instead of letting the dominant narrative write their story for them and us. The media tells us that the image of thousands of young men coming from the Middle East to the West should frighten us, that these refugees are coming not to flee violence, but somehow to bring it with them.
I'll spend a few minutes on the despicable public policy involving tens of thousands of American government employees, both in and out of active duty, whose job it is to persuade high school children to enlist in the armed services. It is extraordinarily deceptive and reprehensible psychological pursuit. Then I'll discuss the military's vulnerabilities in this realm and ways that you can and should exploit them. Why should we be concerned with military recruiters chilling with kids in the high school cafeteria? Well, for starters, it's not a volunteer force. It's a recruited force. These statistics are never mentioned in the corporate military media. Listen to this. 40% of Army enlistees never complete their first term. Imagine for a moment the emotional suffering endured by those who really don't volunteer in the first place. There were more than 20,000 deserters in the United States Army alone from the period of 2006 to 2014, and that's only half of our active service. Half of 770,000 active duty soldiers who were polled 2 years ago said they have little satisfaction in or commitment to their jobs. This is a travesty. Musculoskeletal injuries in the military result in 2.2 million medical encounters a year. Now, talk about pain. Nearly half of the 1.6 million veterans of the United States wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have filed injury claims. Military suicides are at an all-time high, or at least close to it. And sexual assaults are also near record levels in the military, despite a propaganda campaign to try to convince you otherwise. Now consider DD Form 4. Man, these guys they've got acronyms and numbers for everything. It's the military's enlistment agreement. And it says, laws and regulations that govern military personnel may change without notice to me. Such changes may accept my status, my pay, allowances, benefits, and responsibilities as a member of the armed forces, regardless of the provisions of this enlistment agreement. What in the hell are we allowing to happen here? It's an outrage. These poor kids, they're screwed. They're red meat for the corporate and military carnivores who produce contracts they can't understand, contracts that go on to rule their lives. High schools teach Chaucer rather than crucial life skills. The Pentagon's greatest asset in the schools is the JROTC program. JROTC, the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps. We've all heard of ROTC. They've got a junior component to it. Over 500,000 children, an all-time high, are indoctrinated into military culture in the high schools. 40% who complete the program enlist in the armed services.
Many international lawyers, international policymakers are losing sight of the overall system, the overall international legal system, which is meant to prevent war. It was meant to ensure sustainable peace at the global level. In fact, it's a very hopeful era with respect to international law, in my view, at the present. And I think civil society and concerned citizens can seize this opportunity. Good news, there are many resources in international law. That is also the bad news, because sometimes it's difficult to find the correct projects or areas to focus one's efforts on. And should one focus on disarmament treaties? Should one focus on the International Criminal Court, etc.? So that is part of the challenge, is to juggle this whole system of international law. And much of what's needed now is, yes, institution building, which isn't necessarily glamorous work, but it's very crucial work to strengthen international legal institutions, and also challenges of coordination between the different areas of international law.
I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is whether the law is the problem or whether the culture of impunity is the problem. The United States does operate within a culture of impunity, and its officials are regularly immunized for the actions on which the state acts on their behalf. Also, the media, I just wanted to mention very quickly, in the media, I did a study of New York Times and Washington Post coverage of drone strikes, and international law, human rights, humanitarian law was completely absent from the coverage. So it's as if these strikes, because the United States is conducting them, it's just understood that they happen in a context of compliance with the law, or in fact that the law is not even really relevant because the United States does not violate the law. And so I think some of these problems that come up is in this discourse, both political and media discourse, the law is only applied to other states and not what the United States does. And so again, I would ask, is the law the problem or is it the lack of enforcement of the law?
Because of this new legal scheme set out in the Charter, legal scholars have argued, for example, Louis Henkin, a U.S. legal scholar, he says that the terminology war was intentionally not used throughout the Charter. It's only used in the preamble as something that the drafters are trying to save the world from. Rather, the language of threats of peace, breach of peace, acts of aggression, etc., are only used. So, in the words of Henkin, international law sought to eliminate the word war, the legal status of war, the institution of war, and the concept of war. And I think that's a very strong legal argument based on the text of the Charter. He notes, Louis Henkin goes on to note, however, that in national constitutions, this new legal status in relation to war is contradicted. In the U.S. Constitution, for example, there's a War Powers Clause, so that's an older document. So there's national constitutions can be out of step. Obviously, mentalities can be very out of step with this new regime, this new way of thinking. Another utilized part of the UN Charter is Chapter 6 about the peaceful settlement of disputes, which obligates, in fact, all members of the United Nations to settle their international dispute by peaceful means. And it lists a whole range of various ways to peacefully settle disputes, many of which are happening, but still very much not enough. And these peaceful settlement of dispute methods have not been truly embraced, I would say, by the international community yet.
We noticed that there wasn't a lot of discussion in Catholic worker circles about whether these sacrifices were really being effective in creating the type of change that we need. People would talk a lot about bearing witness or about speaking truth to power. There's even a saying in the Catholic worker that Jesus never told us to be successful, only to be faithful. And I think that there's a need for us to challenge ourselves on this point. We can't be satisfied with just being in the right, morally speaking. We need to be strategic, and we need to look at how protest movements can actually force change. So as my brothers and I got more and more involved, we became interested in finding people who were organizing to build power and who were forming the movements of the kind of size and strength that we really need to create change. And that led us to a couple different places. One place was to the labor movement. My brothers and I have all worked on labor campaigns. My older brother, Francis, remains a union organizer. And the other place was to people doing nonviolent direct action, but doing direct action that was not meant just to be an individual act of moral witness, but instead people who had a real goal of building mass movements. And a next formative experience for me and Paul related to what the media was calling the anti-globalization movement and what activists called the global justice movement. And this protest in Seattle exploded into the headlines, and the political climate totally changed. People were flooding into activist meetings. Hundreds of people said that they were willing to go to jail. There was all of this energy that seemed to break the rules of traditional organizing. And that was all very exciting. But within a year or so, it all fell apart. The energy was gone, and that became a very disorienting time. We were trying to figure out what had happened and why did that happen. Over time, we started to notice something. Every once in a while, these moments of mass revolt would happen again. It was not a one-time thing. So there was another explosion of movement activity around the Iraq War in 2003, which I think most people here were probably a part of. And then there was another explosion around immigrant rights in 2006 when millions of people took to the street in Los Angeles and beyond. Then there was a full year of explosions in 2011 with the Arab Spring and with Occupy Wall Street. And now we're seeing it again with the movement for Black Lives. And one thing we noticed is that every time one of these things would happen, the media would treat it in the same way. They called it spontaneous. They called it unplanned. They called it emotional. They called it uncontrolled. They said it was a once-in-a-lifetime event. But once we started looking, we saw that these once-in-a-lifetime events were actually happening all the time. And then we noticed another trend. It wasn't just the media or the public at large that didn't really know how to handle these eruptions. It was also true in the activist world. Many of the organizers that we most respected from the world of labor and community organizing actually didn't have much to say when these moments, these explosions of revolt would break out. And in some cases, they were even very dismissive of them. They said, you can't rely on these things. They don't build up organization. They flare up and then they die out. Because of that, they sort of chose to ignore these outbreaks. And as a result of this, we saw that there was a gap between the worlds of what we call structure-based organizing on the one side and the world of mass protest on the other. Now, in the world of structure-based organizing in unions and in community groups, the techniques and methodologies are very well mapped out. There are books like Rules for Radicals or the Midwest Academy Handbook, all sorts of guides for how to organize in that model. But the dynamics of mass mobilizations were much more murky and mysterious. So we thought, well, what if we don't treat these things as flukes? What if we really study their dynamics? What if we get to the bottom of how to sustain outbreaks of revolt when they happen, how to harness their power, and maybe even how we can create uprisings from scratch?
One of the lessons we seem to be learning is that all the challenges before us are intertwined and that we must have a strategy that keeps this understanding in the forefront. The movements of the 60s did not find a way to leverage all the energy and the people that they had. The peace movement is in a unique position to provide a narrative that gives a vision of how all these struggles are connected and what a new world of peace and justice will look like. When I told my son, an Iraq war veteran, about the amount of pushback I was receiving from people within Veterans for Peace about my VFP participation in the movement for Black Lives, he said to me, "I thought you all are Veterans for Peace." He got it. People understand there is a global system perpetuating violence and economic exploitation in our communities around the world. People get it. We have to get it and show people we do by supporting the struggles where we can bring the anti-war and global perspective. We have to show up with our minds and our bodies. We have to make peace relevant. I close with peace is justice in action. The peace movement needs to help confront injustice and bring about justice so that we can achieve the change we seek. None of the movements can do it alone, none of them. We must do it together.
We have to start reclaiming our country by reclaiming a political dialogue that is rooted in reality and not in mythology. And it has to be rooted in the ability to break out of the two-party system right now, which is taking America to hell in a handbasket.
We don't get a hell of a lot of wins in the peace movement, so I want to acknowledge all the work that people in this room did to get the Iran peace deal, which is such an important step forward, and the best thing that Obama has done as far as foreign policy. And to also call out that I think one of the most vibrant parts of the peace movement, and perhaps not acknowledged enough here, is the pro-Palestine work and the way the boycott divestment movement has just taken off all over the country, has a lot of dynamism, young people, people of color, the way the Black Lives Matter people have embraced the Palestine movement, and with let's see, maybe a Hillary in the White House, it's really going to blow up because she has really attacked that movement, and it's just going to give a lot more energy for those of us involved in BDS. And I also want to give a shout out to recognize that the Women's Boat to Gaza is on its way to Gaza right now with our wonderful Ann Wright aboard.
But on top of that we told the Palestinians that we have to get ourselves trained in nonviolence. And this training have to do a lot with changing our attitude, that not only thinking that the armed struggle is the only solution for our efforts, that there is an alternative.
So the first step is starting to live and act like you are in a culture of peace and justice and nonviolence. What do you think of that? I think that's a very profound truth. That's everything Michael was saying. That's why I'm just giving you a footnote here. I think about that a lot. How can we act as if we are already in what we want? And that has to mean a radical change in every aspect of life, personally, communally, nationally, globally. We're living now, from this moment on, in the culture of peace and nonviolence.
Iraqi resistance to U.S. occupation is not a model for U.S. resistance to some fantasized invasion of the United States by Vladimir Putin and Edward Snowden leading a wild band of Muslim Hondurans to come and take our guns away. The right model is nonviolent non-cooperation, the rule of law, diplomacy, and that can begin now. And the chance of violent conflicts can be enormously minimized.
We have to be movement builders. And Michael just explained it. The world is moving. We never in history have had the opportunity we have at this moment. 85 nonviolent revolutions the last 30 years. 2/3 at least of the human race documented now as part of the grassroots movements for justice and peace. It never happened before. The New York Times saying on that day, Michael, remember? February 16th, the next day, we now have a second superpower on the planet. That's us, the movement.
And so we started out with the weapon that has a bad reputation or a worse reputation than some of the other ones, and that is cluster bombs. Human Rights Watch did a great report about how cluster bombs are being used. The United States is furnishing Saudi Arabia with cluster bombs that are being used in Yemen, even though the international community has banned cluster bombs. So we focused on this. There were groups where the factory of Textron, who was making these, they were protesting, like Massachusetts Peace Action. They were protesting at their Delaware plant. Others were protesting at their headquarters. There, at the same time, we were protesting in front of the Saudi embassies, at the U.S. State Department, in front of the White House, and we were organizing members of Congress. And we did a pretty amazing job for a beginning campaign, which is when there was a vote in Congress, it was 202 people against selling these cluster bombs versus 216. So we came very, very, very close. So much pressure that Obama then stepped up and said he was going to put a halt on the sale of cluster bombs. And then Textron in September said it was going to stop the production of cluster bombs.
Well, I got invited to speak in Carbondale, Illinois. And the groups there kind of just came together and said, this isn't working. So we've launched Nonviolent Carbondale. And the longtime activists on all different issues came together and started having their meetings just before the city council meeting. This was years ago. And then they started meeting with the police department. Then they were in inner cities with the worst violent blocks. Then they were in the schools. Then they were in the healthcare. Then their libraries. And what they did was they lifted up a vision of how their city could become a culture of peace and nonviolence.
What if the U.S. committed to spending even half of our military budget to create a better life for every person on the planet and challenge other nations to do the same? What a much higher quality of life and more security for all people on Earth. Rather than creating ever more enemies, we could create ever more friends.
And I don't know if you've been hearing what's happened. Some of us were invited to Rome to meet for a week with the Vatican officials under the invitation of Pope Francis. And we've been continually shocked. We're continuing to work with the Vatican regularly. 3 weeks ago it was announced through our work that the Pope is issuing a statement on January 1st for the first time since the Sermon on the Mount on nonviolence. But we have asked him to write a formal encyclical like he did on the earth. And we are getting an audience and hearing on this, and movement is happening. This is hopeful. And he's going to, if we can get this to happen, we'll call the world to this vision of a culture of peace and nonviolence. If that happens, and certainly with the January statement, use it. People like Pope Francis right now around the world, and it's a very mainstream way to help us get this vision of a culture of peace and nonviolence into the mainstream.
The mission of World Beyond War was created very deliberately to be an anti-war organization as part of an international movement to abolish war forever and to create a lasting and just peace.
A series of steps might look like this. 1, stop arming other countries and groups. 2, create U.S. support for and participation in institutions of law, nonviolence, diplomacy, and aid as developed in the book that's in your packets, A Global Security System, An Alternative to War. End ongoing wars. Number 4, take the U.S. down to no more than twice the next leading military spender, investing in transition to a peaceful, sustainable economy. Number 5, close foreign bases. Number 6, eliminate weapons that lack any defensive purpose. Number 7, take the U.S. down to no more than the next leading military spender and continue to keep pace with a reverse arms race. There is no doubt that the United States would trigger a universal reverse arms race if it led it. Number 8, eliminate nuclear and other of the worst weapons. A nice step would be for the U.S. to join the ban on cluster bombs now that the U.S. has momentarily stopped producing them. Number 9, establish a timetable for the total elimination of war.
A casualty of a culture of violence that we're facing is the loss of the imagination, which is at the heart of this topic that you've asked me to say a word on. You can no longer imagine that peace is possible, as Michael said. You ask anybody, can we have a world without war, a world without racism, a world without nuclear weapons? No, no, no. Our job, as Michael said, is to be visionaries of peace and nonviolence and help people to reclaim the imagination for peace and nonviolence. That's what our elders did throughout their lives. And the ones I'm talking about, the movements, because movements are the only way. And the ones I study are the abolitionists. Now, these people are just wacky. They're fantastic. They come along, and this is my imitation of Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison. Today, we are announcing the abolition of slavery. The people, you can hardly say it with straight. Are you crazy? There's always been slavery. It's in the Bible. Some people aren't people. He said, no. A new world is coming. A new world of equality. And they reclaimed the public imagination of what it means to be a human being. And that was the breakthrough that led to the movement. We have to stand on their shoulders. Our job is even harder. And we're going to stand on the shoulders of Dr. King. And that's what we're doing this weekend. And we're saying, excuse me, America. Today in Washington, D.C. at American University, we are announcing the abolition of war. End racism and poverty and greed and sexism and torture and executions and nuclear weapons and catastrophic climate change and every aspect of this evil system of violence. And they're going to say no, you're crazy. And we're going to say, no. A new world is coming. A new world of nonviolence.
No more war! No more war!
We used to believe it was all human nature, and there wasn't too much you could do. War is inevitable, that's what they said, and everyone thought it was true. So we blasted away with our bombs and our guns, till the smoke finally cleared and the fighting was done, only to find out that no one had won, way back in the days before the end of war. Once some guy went so far to say, try to imagine no heaven, no hell, and no God, no king, no country, not even possessions. We all thought he was asking a lot. So we kept on fighting for all of this stuff, but it never turned out to be reason enough to justify losing people we loved. Yeah, that's what we did before the end of war. The end of war. Now I cannot recall how it actually happened, but it wasn't by some grand decree. It's like trying to explain why nobody saw it once everyone started to see that the world was much smaller than ever before, and over there wasn't so far anymore. What we did unto others washed up on our shore. The answer was hard to ignore.